recording the class, so if you want to revisit things or if there's things that you miss, it'll be up on my YouTube page eventually, and so you'll have free access to it there. Um, the paper handout that I passed out, the top QR code on there goes to like a link tree for me, and so you'll be able to find my YouTube page through that. I'm just gonna close this.
Do you want to take the questions to
Uh, that would be helpful in more less so from the recording end, but more from the time end, because there's a lot of material to cover. Um, I'm also going to kind of disclaim my like natural way of speaking is like a professor. Um, Holly can tell you that from seeing like how I talk online. Uh, but
Great.
thank you. And I'm also an historian by training, and so a lot of the class we're going to talk about history because we need that history as a background for talking about witches because so much of our history education has been built around telling us that witches don't exist. And no one thought that during the time where witch trials were happening because it isn't true that witches didn't exist. Witches did exist. And so every time that we're like, well, there were no witches, and so no one was a witch during any of these trial periods, unless we're talking about like Salem. In Salem, there were either no witches or there was one witch. Um, Salem, you can pretty much be like, yeah, no witches. But throughout Europe, there are trials where there were, and there are trials where there weren't. And that is something that is important to understand. So we're going to go through a lot about witch trials and how we think about witch trials and the causes of witch trials because so much of what people assume about that is incorrect. And in order for us to frame how we look at trial material and how we look at historical witches and sources of information about historical witches, we have to have that framing where we understand like this was a much more complex thing than it's treated as, and the points where it was simple are points that verify that yeah there were witches. So I'm going to start off with a quote: "A fertile error is better than a boring fact." And that was said by the historian Hugh Trevor Roper. And he was important in kind of the history of witchcraft. He was one of the first people publishing about witchcraft in the 1960s when the historical study of witchcraft really developed. So, like when we talk about Margaret Murray and the witch cult in Europe being published in the 19 teens, and then her second book on witches in the early 1920s. She was an anthropologist or not an anthropologist, she was an Egyptologist, but she wasn't really trained in the sort of historical things that she was talking about there. And historians don't tend to look at her work about witchcraft as history of witchcraft. And most of the early writing around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, isn't really looked at as serious historical work on witchcraft. It's really in the 60s and 70s that the study of magic as an actual historical discipline becomes viable. Around the 20s, you start to see it becoming viable as an anthropological discipline. And and that's kind of important to think about when we think about how academia works on that. Like right now, we're super blessed because you have like major programs you can do where you're studying things about magic and history of magic and the anthropology of magic. There's tons of publishing around it, and so for those of us who want to explore historical modalities of magic and traditional forms of magic, we don't just have to wait for magical writers to write about these things. We have these educated scholars writing about these things as well and publishing old books on magic that they have translated and discovered in old libraries and things like that. So, pretty cool time, but that all starts around the 1960s and 70s. And so you go from a point where people began to be interested in that, and then you've got people who were interested in that who were also kind of connected to the kind of growing magical and neo-pagan movements and had to keep that interaction secret. And then now where you've got a little bit more where there can be overlap where people can be both historians and academics and also practitioners. But that's because both movements are relatively recent movements that we had that progression. And I've got to make sure I don't have too many of these things where I would like add stuff like that because most of that wasn't actually supposed to be in there. But so Trevor Roper believed that there was no widespread belief in witches, but that witches were a result of cult thinking amongst academics and elites and theologians. And so he was one of the early writers to kind of establish this idea that most people didn't believe in witches. Witches weren't really a thing. That whether or not people believed in magic wasn't important. That this is a social issue about scapegoating, about persecution, about state violence, and about sort of chaos and destruction in society. A lot of that thinking that we have to frame witchcraft and witchcraft history in a social structure that explains how this could have happened comes from around that time of Trevor Roper. Now, his theories have some elements of truth, but for the most part, like many theories that provide a sweeping, simple explanation for witch trials, it's an example of fertile error, which again, Trevor Roper believed was important. Fertile error is the idea that a reasonable enough and meaningful enough falsehood that can stimulate discussion and intellectual exploration is better than a simple fact that answers a question and doesn't allow for further inquiry. The problem with that is that while that's true to a degree, fertile errors can also obfuscate inquiry by creating answers that are scapegoats. So just as Trevor Roper felt that the witches were scapegoats, coming up with these various social theories for why witchcraft was persecuted become scapegoats for explaining the problem. They become ways that we can answer the problem without having to actually engage the problem and look at what was actually happening. And so the beginning of the historical study of witchcraft, kind of beyond Trevor Roper, like the next few years after, was largely around the rejection of this idea of fertile error. So what are some of our common fertile errors in studying witchcraft? The first one obviously is that there were no witches. Because if there were no witches, what are we all doing? Like, if we're going to say that we are connecting back to this historical past of witches, there had to be witches in that historical past for us to do that. But some popular answers are that witchcraft trials were about attempts to take land and money. They were about quarrels between neighbors. And the most popular one is probably that it is entirely about misogyny, that misogyny is the only element of it. Fungal hallucinations, fantasies that were spurred on by torture, responses to political and social protest. So each of these things has some merit in some cases. So to say that these are not full solutions to explaining what the reason for witchcraft trials was doesn't mean that these things weren't factors or that they didn't occur. There were definitely times where political issues came into play in some of the most famous witch trials. Fungal hallucinations might have caused some things, but one of the major criticisms of that is there simply was not enough fly agaric or ergo throughout Europe to cause this on the scale that it happened. Misogyny was important, but more for shaping what happened rather than causing what happened. Quarrels between neighbors could be tried as quarrels between neighbors. They didn't have to be tried as witchcraft, and frequently they weren't tried as witchcraft. In terms of attempts to take land and money, in a lot of cases, people didn't really own any land or have any money. So these are all things where they could be explanations sometimes, but they clearly can't be explanations all the time. The attempt to have some sort of essential explanation of witch trials as a singular phenomenon with a singular cause is generally rooted in two things. The first are the personal social biases and experiences of the historian. So we mentioned Hugh Trevor Roper before. To quote an academic review on Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic, which is like one of the most important books in the foundation of the historical study of witchcraft. Trevor Roper, for the most part, saw the witch hunt through the prism of the world war in which he himself served. It was ultimately a story of collective organized lunacy and cruelty, and Trevor Roper wrestled with the question of why liberal, humane, learned men were caught up in an artificial system of nonsense. So from that perspective, like you can't look at or study history if like you're gonna just think that everything that people thought at the time was nonsensical. If you can't put yourself in the view of the people, but it's important that it's like okay, so he went through this world war, he went through this time of lunacy and chaos and destruction, and so he looks at history and he sees that this is the way people behave, this is the way people experience things, and so this must be what the cause is. And when we think about those other causes that people throw up, attempts to take land and money, we see the government do that now. We see corporations do that now. We see people do that to each other now. We wrestle with issues of misogyny now, and a lot of the focus on misogyny as the overwhelming factor comes from the kind of link between the image of the witch and feminism in the 60s, and which is around the time that these historical studies were starting. Torture was not always legal during periods where the witch trials were happening, but torture did happen, and it's something where we have had social justice issues around torture and confessions taken from torture, information gathered with torture throughout the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. So these are all issues that modern people are aware of and modern people are dealing with. And so we look at them and we see pieces of them and we say, okay, these must be what the root cause was, because these are things we can see as root causes today. The second issue is the refusal to believe in magic, because people today, really most people today do believe in magic, but they know they're supposed to say they don't. And the view that magic is irrational. And so accepting that rational people could have believed in magic is impossible from that worldview. And so if we're going to say that historical people were rational, then they must not have actually believed in witches. To illustrate that, again, describing Trevor Roper, explaining that by contrast, he was not concerned with mere witch beliefs, with those elementary village credulities which anthropologists discover. So he didn't like the idea that anthropologists were going around looking at living tribal cultures, seeing their witchcraft practices, and that the new generation of historians was looking at that and comparing that to European practices. He didn't want to say that Europeans saw the world that way, or that Europeans experienced the world in a way that was similar to what he called darkest Africa. And another quote from a current historian who is just in his 60s now. He was born a little bit before Trevor Roper was writing, and is still a current popular historian. But today, we do not have to share Dr. Maxwell Stewart's opinion that Gray, Webster, and Wishart were casting secret spells. Indeed, we would be unlikely to believe that such spells would have had the desired results that Donaldson, Davidson, and Piet experienced. And that's Julian Godard. And Godard's one who, like, he's a popular historian. You would probably see some of his books or his articles if you were looking at witchcraft history. And so he's throwing out that, like, hey, we don't believe that magic was real. We don't believe that people were doing this magic stuff, so we can't explain history by saying that people believed in that or that people were actually doing it. So going into the refusal to believe in magic or the existence of witches and how these ideas developed both as part of the structure of Protestant rejection of Catholicism while still actively interpreting witches as a threat, Protestantism was very invested in saying miracles weren't real. Magic is not a real thing, but it's a dangerous thing that still happens because the devil can make it happen. So it was part of their fight against Catholicism to reject all of these elements. But Protestants were also like hugely involved in the persecution of witches because they still found this to be a threat from the devil. And so going into all the details of how that worked is kind of too much for a class that we have in an hour and a half setting. It is super interesting stuff. But the kind of false rationalism that we have today that obscures the basis of witch hunts is important to understand because we have to reject that if we are going to explore the ideas of witches historically, explore what witchcraft was historically and explore how that informs us today. So another quote about religion, the decline of magic. Functionalism ended up functioning as a way to rationalize not just magic, but also religion, enabling a focus on its material and social uses, and researchers to largely avoid dealing with the fact that the witch hunt occurred because early modern people simply believed in witches. And so it's a perspective that historians have held on to since the 70s or 80s, that we have to understand that people just believed these things. This was just a reality for people. They lived in and experienced a world where witches were real, magic was real, there was a real threat from this, and this is why this phenomenon happened. So when we talk about what the prevailing cause of witch trials are, in virtually all cases, the cause of witch trials is the fact that people believed in witches and the efficacy of magic to cause harm. This is the consistent underlying element that is present almost universally. So all of those other explanations that are popular that people use to kind of dismiss the witch trials, those happen in some cases. But there are also huge amounts of cases where those things aren't factors at all. But the belief in witches is almost always a factor. Even in cases where witches were tried under Protestant rule, and the Protestants were trying to reject the idea of magic and miracles, they still believed that the devil caused these things. So your common person tended to believe that witches were people who had an innate power that allowed them to access magic, allowed them to access the spirit world, allowed them to do things that could cause harm to others. Theologians and the elite, and particularly reformers, did not believe that. They believed that the devil was acting through these people, the devil was deluding these people, but that the devil was still facilitating power for them and facilitating magic for them. Consorting with the dead or with fairies was believed to be the devil in disguise, or the devil creating an illusion that these things happened, but that the effects of that consortion were still real, and they were real through the power of the devil. They claim that the witch does not fly through the air at night, the witch does not leave their body in spirit, but that the witch willingly allows themselves to consort with the devil, who makes them believe they are doing these things. So even while denying the diversity of magical experience and the nature and ways in which magical experience happened, these people who were hunting witches still believed that there was a magical experience happening, up until about the point that we start to have the decline of the witch trials. There are two other major factors that are consistent underlying the witch trials: the Little Ice Age and fear. Now, fear is kind of the obvious one, but the Little Ice Age is one that doesn't tend to get discussed a lot in this. So it begins about 100 years before the witch trials. The period of the witch trials starts around the 1430s, but there are witch trials in the late 1300s as well. They're just more sporadic. And an interesting thing about those, a lot of people think of witch trials as a top-down phenomenon that, again, because we try to explain that people didn't really believe this, they talk about, oh, witch trials were about controlling the populace by creating a scapegoat enemy. Witch trials were about suppressing the populace and their ability to stand up against the state. And so it was all created by these elites, and the elites forced these witch trials to happen. The initial witch trials that happened in the 1300s were a response to mostly crop issues, and peasants insisted that people in their communities be tried as witches. And the elites initially were like, well, witches don't exist, or we don't have trials for that. We don't really do this. It wasn't something that happened routinely throughout the Middle Ages. And when it started to happen, it was the peasants that were pushing it to happen and forcing it to happen. And the issues that they were experiencing were issues that were happening because of climate change, which, if we look at the fact that economic collapse and climate change and social upheaval and shifts in religiosity were kind of the underlying things that were terrifying people and happening at the time, really kind of scary for looking at today, because we're going through all of those exact same issues that late medieval and the beginning of the early modern period people were happening. So Europe had experienced what they call the climate maximum, and so there was a huge amount of growth in towns, huge population growth, super great crop yields, major economic growth, tons of trading happening, and that's all going on through the 11th and 12th century into the beginning of the 13th century, and then middle of the 13th century, climate collapse starts because of a bunch of volcanoes. And then everything is downhill from there until the 18th century. And so you've got the plagues begin to happen routinely, famines happen, people are cannibalizing each other. And like, this is a literal, just like regular history stuff that this is happening. All kinds of craziness and turmoil. And then you begin to get reformers saying that this is because people are not perfect Christians and the church is not perfect, and that people are not living their lives in the way that the church should be forcing them to live. And then you get reformers taking their ideas and they're saying the church is so not perfect that we need a new church and we need to reject the church. In fact, the church is in league with the Antichrist, and the church works with the devil. All these miracles that the church claims that it does, they come from the devil, and they come from priests that are lying and trying to trick people in order to serve these false things that the church is doing. So the Protestants were really like, we're going to tear everything down. And that lays the groundwork for this idea that it's like, okay, we're in this sort of apocalyptic nightmare where the world is falling apart. The Antichrist is clearly operating in the world. The devil is clearly operating in the world. Our institutions could be in line with them, or maybe these new institutions that are trying to form are causing this apocalyptic state and are in league with the devil, and who knows what's happening. And so there's a shift in the idea that there are witches who are these people who kind of fly out at night and go with the good folk and go with these ancient goddesses and have feasts and parties with them, to there are witches who are this sort of diabolical army and this cult of people trying to destabilize society and destroy community. And initially, the theologians saying this, they're like, but these witches are supposed to be here because they're a scourge. They're God's wrath punishing us in order to show us what the worst of us could be, and then punishing us for not being better through those who are the worst of us in order to remind us that we should be good people. And then that shifts to, these are the people who are wanton and horrible and are hurting us, and so we need to destroy them. And that's where we get the kind of fear that's happening, where we get the climate issues that underlie the social change in Europe at the time, and where we go from the idea that it's like, yeah, there's probably witches out there and they probably do stuff and we just avoid it and maybe we shouldn't even really believe in it, to this is a real and present danger and it's heresy to not believe that it exists, and everyone needs to be ready to stop these witches and turn in people that you suspect to be witches. That's where we go from kind of like, witches happen and maybe we'll try it occasionally, to there's an absolute hysteria and we're just going to kill whole towns at this point. So the value of exploring historical witches. So at this point, it's like, one thing that I think we have to understand, outside of the fact that in the minds of people in the early modern period, witches were real and there was a real and present danger from witches, and this is why this happened, is that witches were never the people who were your good, helpful people. They weren't priests and priestesses, they weren't healers, they weren't midwives. The witches were always kind of othered, magical strangeness. If you go back to the Salic laws, which were written in the 6th century, it's already talking about how it's illegal to be a cannibal witch, because these were beliefs that were holdovers from the pagan beliefs at the time. These weren't ideas that Christians created. There were already beliefs that there were these dangerous, magical people that were other than regular humans existing in the world. And so there were other magicians that were more or less okay under Catholicism throughout the Middle Ages. And there's like some tension and some debate about what magic is okay, what magic's not okay. But Generally, people believed in magic. Generally, there was magic that was okay, and there was magic that wasn't okay. And generally, what was associated with people who were witches were things that were a little more supernatural, like leaving the body, going and partying with spirits, going and partying with like these ancient gods and feasting with them, gaining powers through doing this. So you're a regular person, they might be able to do some magic by taking a particular stone that reflects an astrological feature and saying a Bible verse over it and burning some herbal incense because God has put power into that stone, into that astrological feature, into those herbs, and the Bible verse has some power. And that would be okay, and the person doesn't have any power and isn't doing anything. They're not engaging with spirits. But if someone can look at you and curse you by looking at you, or if someone can just talk about, oh, your lands are so nice and your crops are so plentiful, and that destroys your crops, that person has power themselves. Or if that person is able to go into the woods and bring back the spirits from the woods and make those spirits do things for them, that's someone who is frightening and dangerous. And that's what the witch was in this historical modality. And really, it's still what the witch is today. It's just not what we've been told witches are by people who were kind of listening to Margaret Murray and her fantasy world. Why we would want to study, look at historical witches. So our ability to engage with historical witches again requires at least the possibility that historical witches existed. So we can talk about like, okay, this happened because people believed this happened, but people didn't believe it happened because the church told them that it was a thing. The church initially was like, these aren't real. This doesn't happen. It's illegal to believe in this. This is something that people believed in because they experienced it. People experienced traveling out of their bodies at night. People experienced going to the Sabbath with Diana or Abundia or Satya or Holda and having these parties where they would eat from a bowl and then the goddess would strike the bowl with a stick and restore the bowl. They experienced flying with the good folk at night out through different places. They experienced having ghosts and fairies come talk to them and tell them how to heal people or tell them how to punish people that wronged them, and then following what they were told to do and seeing results from it. It's the same thing with looking at other cultures anthropologically. We can't look at them and say that their beliefs are nonsense, their beliefs weren't real, when they're having experiences that cause them to have those beliefs. We have to understand that something within their context is allowing for this to be real to them, whether it's something that we experience and perceive as real ourselves. Now, here, most people at a conference like this are going to be like, well, yeah, I've experienced things. I know that these things that these medieval people were experiencing are real. So it's a little easier for us. And because we have that perspective, we can go through and say, like, all right, we can reconnect with these witches, these witch ancestors, as Sarah would call them. So if there were no witches, then there's no reclamation of the term witch. And if there were no witches, there's no one who contemporary witches are the spiritual inheritors of. There's a lot of room to debate, though, whether or not contemporary witches have a real relationship with historical witches, because a lot of modern witchcraft is based on 19th century Protestant esoteric thinking and not anything to do with medieval magic or a pagan past or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that's the only way we can be witches today. Modern witches can totally go back and look at what these historical modalities were. They can look at the pagan past, they can look at the medieval magic and the early modern magic and be like, that's the kind of witch I want to be. That's what I want to do. I'm not going to be a Crystal Karen, to take, again, Sarah's reference there, since at least some of you were in that class too. Now, regardless of one's approach to witchcraft today, whether we want to go and party with the Queen of Elfame and the devil and get actual power from them, or whether or not we want to super glue crystals to the steering wheel of our car, like you've seen in memes on the internet, I'm sure. There's room to have benefit from looking at historical witches. So one is we can look at them as a collective body of witch saints, or dead who are possessors of magic and queered in such a manner which will provide a liminal relationship with death and allow us to engage them more fully as allies in magic and a source of channeled power. Now, when I say queered there, I mean weird. I don't mean that like all witches in the medieval and early modern era were gay. I mean, maybe they were. Maybe it was a huge party and everything was fun. Probably not, because it was the Middle Ages, and then later on people were being killed. But people have questioned that use of queer there, because they're like, why are we trying to associate witchcraft with gayness? Which, I mean, that's been a thing in the modern witchcraft movement since at least the 70s, like the advent of kind of the LGBTQIA rights movement and the advent of the witchcraft movement have a lot of overlap. And there was writing early on trying to claim that all this witchcraft stuff was things that were parts of queer heritage, whether it was or not. But that's definitely informed the shape of modern witchcraft. But historically, queer doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means things that are kind of quantum. They're things that it's like it's operating in more than one space at once and being more than one thing at once, and you can't pin it down into something that's normative, because it isn't exactly normative. It isn't exactly one thing. It's all of these things at the same time, and that's that liminality that makes the witch. And so when we talk about that in terms of the idea of a witch saint, which is like a super modern term, but we're basically saying, okay, we understand this idea of saints in Catholicism or in other traditions where we've applied that word saint as like a holy person, and we don't always understand it as this is a holy person. We understand it as this is a person who's dead and they're magic. They're dead and they're able to do things in the world because they are specially empowered to do things in the world, and we can go to them for help. And so when we say witch saints, that's what we're talking about. And what makes them that is that if they are authentically witches, in like the actual like historical idea of what a witch is, they are kind of quasi-human already. They are partially human, partially spirit world denizens, or people who consort with spirit world denizens and who have spirit world contracts and are already moving back and forth between living spaces and spirit spaces in their lifetime while they're working. And so that doesn't go away when you die. Humans in general, if you engage with dead humans and you give them ways to access the world, then there is a cycle of life and death. And whether that cycle of life and death is a cycle of reincarnation or not, or if it's simply a cycle of the world being built from and informed by the dead, and the world of the dead and the world of the living mirroring each other and interacting with each other, when bridges are created between those worlds, the dead are able to interact with the world of the living, and the living are able to interact with the world of the dead. But when you have people who already are bridges between those worlds, they retain that bridge function and are able to act more powerfully and a little more directly and a little more on their own than your regular dead are. And so having a body of deceased witches means there's a body of powerful allies to call upon in that fashion who have that ability to function in the world. And so, like, I hate it when people have these campaigns of, we need to exonerate all the witch trial victims, and we need to say there were no witches and that these people were all innocent, because we're not re-adjudicating these cases. We're not going back and looking at them and being like, oh, we found new evidence and this was clearly not a witch. All we're saying is witches didn't exist, and so no one could have been guilty of this. And from the perspective of someone who is a witch, who looks at that witch heritage and looks at that as a culture that you are sort of part of, or maybe not a culture, but a continuum that you're part of, then saying that your people don't exist, it's like, how is that helpful? How does that bring any power, any usefulness to the world? There's also a lot of like kind of elements of how we think about law and court systems and all, where it's like this is a questionable idea also, because we're presuming that none of these court systems work properly, when there were definitely points where they didn't, but there were a lot of points where they did. And so further reason, body of witch saints to turn to as potential spirit teachers, familiars, and guides. So we can look at the witch saints as people, and when I say witch saints, I really just mean basically anyone who was witched. We can look at the witch saints as people that we kind of call upon and engage with and draw power from, that we channel their power through us. We call them to be present when we work. So there's a continuum of working throughout time and history and across the spirit world border. But we can also call them to be people who come and speak to us in our dreams, people who come and speak to us spiritually and psychically, people who teach us and guide us in magic, show us magic things that we can't learn from books, that we might not be able to learn from living teachers. And it's possible to have them even as familiars. Like a lot of times we think of fairies and demons as familiars, but the dead were frequently familiars as well. And so that's something where you're not going to like call upon a deceased witch and bind them and trap them as your familiar. I mean, you can, but that seems kind of villainous. And I mean, maybe that's kind of a witchy thing in an historical sense. But I'd probably rather call on one and be like, hey, do you want to be bros? And I'll like give you wine and liquor and food and candy and play music for you, and you'll give me more magic. And that sounds like a good deal. But again, we need to have witches existing in order for that to happen. Witches as progenitors of ways of power, whose power we inherit and take part in when we engage in the ways of power modeled after and which honor and recall their own. And so this is something that we talk about a lot in other magical traditions. So like when we do grimoire magic, we're like, Solomon did this grimoire magic. All of these medieval magicians did this grimoire magic. All of these early modern magicians did this grimoire magic. A handful of people in the modern period did this grimoire magic, and then people went a little crazy and were just like, let's draw symbols in the air instead. And then now people are doing the grimoire magic instead again. And so when we do that grimoire magic, we're doing it with everyone who did it before. So we're doing the same rituals, saying the same words, using the same tools that these people in the past did. And so every time it's done, those things are empowered through that reuse. And so we take part of that channel of power, that community of power, and we can even invoke those previous magicians so that it's as if we're working again across time, across the border of the spirit world with them. Same thing with the witches. When we look at practices associated with historical witches, when we look at Isabel Gowdy and it's like, okay, haddock and hare and haddock, and whatever other little incantations she described in her trial, and then we build spells that use those, then we're drawing on that connection with her. We're drawing on that connection with any other folklore that used those words that she used after that, and connecting with those people who use them, and drawing on that power of the use of those words. They become models of magical practice whose stories provide us with inspiration and instruction for magical acts and for frameworks for engaging with witchcraft. So again, we can kind of say, oh my gosh, Margaret Murray, coolest person ever. I'm going to put up posters of her in my room and read her books. And I'm going to take Leyland Zaradia and I'm going to build a underground pagan witch cult that is exactly what she described. And you could have something cool and valid doing that. Or you could say, I'm going to look at a bunch of 19th century records of folklore, because there weren't a lot of them before that. But when I can find an 18th or 17th century record of folklore, I'm going to look at those too. And I'm going to look at some witch trial accounts. And I'm going to build a model of what a witch was based on that and live that lifestyle. And that can be completely valid and cool too. And that's going to be some of what we are looking at today. This is actually going more on pace time-wise than I was expecting. So there's a lot of sources for information on historical witches and witchcraft. And I think a lot of people, because I talk a lot about looking at historical magic and bringing back historical magic, and particularly with witches, I feel very strongly about reviving the historical concept of what the witch was. And that doesn't mean we have to erase the modern concepts or push the modern concepts out. In fact, generally it's the more modern views of witchcraft that try to push out the historical views and say that we don't exist. There can be room for both. But one of the criticisms of looking at historical witchcraft and saying, like, well, yeah, witches are supernatural monsters. Go be a supernatural monster, and here's how we do it and how we learn about it, is that, well, in order to look at that, you've got to look at the trial accounts. And the trial accounts were a bunch of, like, angry, sexually repressed men who were doing this as torture porn, and none of it's real and none of it's true. And it's like, well, that's a really bad assessment of what the trial accounts are. It's true in some cases, like Delanker. That's 100% what's happening with Delanker, as he's like going through and like having weird fetishization about young Basque girls. But the a lot of cases and a lot of periods worked through normal court systems that were behaving normally and that didn't accept everything as just like, oh, somebody made this accusation, it must be fact. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that and give some examples of that as well. But the thing is, trial accounts aren't the only things we can look at as sources for this. We can look at anthropology, and this allows us to look at living traditions with individuals who meet models of what witchcraft is and what witches are, and look at how this works in living communities, how living communities relate to this, how this matters and means something to them and to their cultures, as something that we can't erase and say doesn't exist. And it can also allow us to look at surviving and previous European customs and beliefs and determine during the time of the witch trials and since then. And so a lot of times when we talk about anthropology, we kind of think of it as we're looking at other outside of Europe cultures, but there's definitely anthropology looking at Europe as well too. But in this case, the distinction is more anthropologists who look at the past as opposed to anthropologists that look at living cultures. But we can apply those same anthropological methods looking at the historical data. Folklorism, and some material that comes out of folklorism. This allows us to look at and explore magical beliefs, beliefs about witches and magical practices that overlap with the regions and time periods of the witch trials. Sometimes, again, we're stuck in those 18th and 19th century sources, and so they're sort of barely overlapping periods or not quite overlapping. But sometimes there are also earlier folklore sources that we can look at as well. And this allows us to look at tales of other beings. So, like looking at stories of fairies and hobgoblins and kobolds and all of those different creatures, and ghosts and Sendigar and all sorts of things, and then compare them with the witch and compare them with the magical beings associated with witches. We can look at theology and mythography. And so we can look at the beliefs of the clergy and academics around what witches did and how those beliefs developed and mirrored and borrowed from folk beliefs and how they were shaped and restructured by them. And so, like, again, Trevor Roper was claiming that these intellectuals just invented all this shit and told common people they had to believe in it. And okay, I was going to say that doesn't work, but I guess we're seeing that happen now in our society, sadly. But probably actually easier to do now with the way media is than it would have been to do then, though. And but when we actually look at the history and what the actual like contemporary academic standard of belief is that there was a cooperation between folk beliefs and the beliefs of the people, and the shaping of those beliefs and reshaping of those beliefs by clergy and intellectuals of the time. That it wasn't something that was just invented whole stock and forced on the people, but it also wasn't something that was purely reflecting exactly what the people believed, but there was a combination of the beliefs of the people and the beliefs of the authorities, and that the two were constantly in sort of a cycle redefining and reshaping each other. Although there's also a lot of evidence that in confessions and in accusations and witness reports that folk belief predominates, but that what is recorded and shows up in the actual court documents is often sort of rewritten and reworked by the court workers who are trying to make it match what the intellectuals and the elite believed. In cases where we have like sort of like the actual things that were said and then the actual things that were put into the documents, we can see that shifting, as well as shifting that's caused by like if So like if Holly was on trial and Holly was like, well, yeah, I left my body and I went and Wick and I were partying with Diana and Abundia, and it was a lot of fun, and we just like danced around and ate food. And I, as the magistrate, am like, so you left your body at night under the influence of the devil?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, yeah, I left my body under the influence of, well, no, I mean, maybe it was the devil, maybe not. I don't know. Diana was there, and so Diana, the devil, was there, and so the magistrates, and we have records that show this, where uh, they would kind of rephrase what people were saying and kind of badger people until people sort of broke or slipped up in what they said, or people started repeating back what they said. And this isn't always happening under torture. In fact, quite frequently it's not. But that's a difficult situation to be in, where like you're in a courtroom and you've got somebody just sort of berating you, telling you this is what your experience was, this is what happened, and you just clearly admitted to it, even though you don't realize you admitted to it. It's really easy to get trapped that way. And over time, as that trapping happens more, and as the courts talk about these things more and put more things out to the people, then the people start coming in sort of predisposed to reflect those ideas. And you start seeing where you'll have cases where people are describing exactly the things that were described by earlier people and weren't diabolical at all. And they come in and they're just like, yeah, the devil fucking rocks. And clearly, I was out partying with the devil and eating the devil's food. Everything they're describing about how they did it and what they did is exactly what the earlier people were describing with their folk beliefs, but now they're just agreeing that it was the devil because they've been enculturated into that idea. Um, and so these ideas end up merging and reshaping each other rather than it being just the leaders claiming this or just the folk beliefs. Looking at myths can also provide us with earlier ideas and examples of magical figures and magical people. So looking at witches like Kerke and Medea, as opposed to only looking at medieval and early modern witches, comparing these ideas about witches in Greek belief, and really like you almost want to kind of like Medea kind of works, but like really like Erecto and Candida, like the ones who are a little more human. Although in a Greek context, a witch is never human. Witches are all descended from Helios. So it's having Helios' sunlight in your blood that makes you a witch. Hecate teaches you to be a witch. Helios makes you a witch. And so, but even looking at that, looking at the fact that it's like, okay, these witches were humans that were other than human. Was a common part of this pagan belief. This wasn't something that just comes up later, but we still see it later. Where when we look at like the Jamaj and the star dragons amongst the Balkan people, where it's again like the witches are descended from these star dragons, so they're humans, but they're other than human because they have this other element of their descent, or witches who are descended from uh, giants or from trolls or from gods or from fairies, as we get like more in the northern regions. This is almost a consistent thing in folklore, that's how it works, and then that's what's something that we see in the beliefs of the people, although again rejected by the authorities. We can look at laws. So, like again, I mentioned earlier the Salic laws. We also have a lot of people are very invested in the idea that witch trials are a Christian thing, but the Greeks had witch trials, the Romans had witch trials, and they had laws that dealt with magic and laws that dealt with witchcraft. And generally, it was sort of okay to do magic. Sometimes it was really okay. It really depends on where and when, because like when we talk about Greece, there is no Greece. There's tons of kingdoms that cover the whole Magna Graeca territory, which is much bigger than modern Greece. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years. Like when we look at Rome, again, we're talking about fewer hundreds of years, but still hundreds of years. And we may be talking about the whole peninsula or we may be talking about the whole empire. So, what people did and thought changes over those times and places. But most generally, magic's illegal if you're using it to hurt people. It's also illegal if you're eating people, because that's the thing. A lot of times, the eating people is like you turn into an owl and you come and you eat their soul and their life, and then they waste away and die. Not like you're having a party and you're cutting people up and eating them. But so like a lot of times we talk about blood libel as like a thing against Jewish people. And so then blood libel becomes a thing that pertains to witches, and we're like, well, that's because the scapegoating of Jews in the Middle Ages moves to a scapegoating of witches, and a lot of the stereotypes about Jews become stereotypes of witches, and that's true. That's an important part of history. But we also have these same accusations against other groups. So the Dionysians and the Bacchics, there's a point where you couldn't have more than 4 Bacchic cult members gather together in Rome without special permission, because they would have spontaneous male on male anal sex, and that was scary, even in Rome. It's okay if it's like a owner and a slave, but not if it's like regular citizens. And they would tear apart babies and kill the babies and eat the babies. Obviously, they weren't doing that, but that was like in their whole like, oh my God, we've got to rein these Bacchics in because they're a threat to the social order and a threat to what's happening, just like witches were a threat to the social order and a threat to what they wanted to happen coherently in the society. They have to have some salacious things that they say about them. And so those Bacchics, they're going to eat some babies. And then when the Bacchics stop being a threat and the Christians start being a threat, well, Christians, they kidnap babies and they cover them in dough, and then they bake the dough baby and they break it apart and eat the dough body of the baby because it's the Eucharist. But it's a way of describing it in a way where it's like, that's terrifying. We need to get rid of these Christians. And then Christians in turn say the same thing about Jews, and then they begin saying it about witches. And so there's a continuity of this. And so there is like an element where the cannibalism thing is like, woo, woo, I'm going to steal your soul. But then there's also like, I'm going to climb in your window and kill your baby. And but those are things where we can see that like these beliefs were things that people actually held because they show up in the laws and in the edicts that happened. And so like again, it shows them the Salic laws in the 6th century, and then again in the 9th or 10th century at Paderborn, Charlemagne doesn't outlaw witches eating people, which is what the Salic laws does. Charlemagne outlaws believing in or hunting witches who you believe eat people. So Charlemagne is like, this doesn't exist, and it's wrong to believe it exists. But that shows that it's something people were believing prior to Charlemagne coming in and converting them to Christians. Archaeological evidence, historical writing, and magical writing. So these things confirm magical practices, the uses of magical items, both before and during the period of witch trials. They allow us to see things outside of the court documents when people are kind of writing about experiences and beliefs and things that are happening in the community. They allow us to see the actual items that people are using. And then in terms of magical writing, we can see things where people are recording descriptions of what they did and actually saying, like, here's how you do this magic that we're accusing people of doing. And a lot of times when we think about magical writing from that period, we think, okay, well, there's the grimoires, and so there's the learned magic. But doctors and theologians, and even sometimes common people who could write, would also write down about folk charms and things that regular people were using magically in their day-to-day lives, particularly doctors and prayer books, and some of your early science books like lapidaries. Huge for finding magical information, because natural magic was mostly okay, at least under Catholics. Under Protestants, like having fun and being alive is wrong. So there's actually a lot of writing about magic and recording what magic people were doing, both before the witch trials and during that. So we can go back and look at actual things that people did. And then finally, we have the trial transcripts, the news pamphlets, and really like the idea of a news pamphlet kind of grows out of and is popularized through the witch trials. This was like the salacious stuff that was happening that people are like, oh shit, they just killed like 11 people over in Pendleton because there's so many witches in that forest living in that community. It's crazy. Or did you guys hear that Count Bothwell like hired a bunch of witches to sink the king's boat as he was coming back from Denmark with the new queen. But the king survived, so we have a king and we have a new queen. But they tried twice to kill him with storms, and the storms almost got him. So it's like those are things that were like they were huge news at the time, and they were things that people actually again really believed in. Um, so there was a profit in writing about these things and putting out these news pamphlets, and a lot of these news pamphlets survive, and you can read them, and they become important records of some of them of what happened, what was said in the trials, what the accusations were, and some of them how people interpreted it and how people viewed it and what the understanding was of it was at the time. Um, you There were also books discussing the trials, particularly as we get towards the end of the trial period. You've got people who are either writing books to justify why they happened, and then you've got other people who are writing books who are like, you guys are assholes. Stop killing these people who clearly have mental illnesses, which was kind of Johann Weris's position. Despite the fact that he was like a student of Agrippa and did magic, he's like, all these people are just deluded and you guys are just killing deluded people, and that's wrong. But also, I'm going to put together a list of demons that becomes the Ars Goetia. And so confessions, accusations, summaries, descriptions of events surrounding the trials, all of these survive in these kind of texts. And again, people often believe we only have the trial material to go on, but trial material exists within the context of a large collective array of materials from all these other sources, as well as all these other materials that were produced in the context of the trials. So the trial material can be some of the most specific, but it still needs to be considered in light of the other sources and the context of the creation of the trial material. So we can't ignore the fact that this is like somebody is like, Wick's been writing these evil books on magic and leading people into doing devilry, and Wick's just like, I'm just super nice and chill. What's going on? And then he gets arrested and put in a cell and not allowed to sleep for days. And then when they bring him in, he's kind of just like, I guess I did these things. I don't know. What are you talking about? And they're like, see, he admitted it, and he's going to jail now. There's definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Like that's why I picked you. So we have to recognize that yes, there are problems with the trial material, and we have to recognize that there is a scale. That there is some trial material that is so bad, and that the situations were so problematic, we probably shouldn't believe anything that it's really saying. And a lot of it probably is not even a good reflection of what the folk beliefs were. These were just people going crazy and saying insane stuff because their society was falling apart, or they thought their society was falling apart, or they thought God was punishing them by making people eat each other 100 years beforehand and then die in a plague 50 years beforehand. Um, and we also have to consider, like, we talk about how many people were killed in the witch trials. It really wasn't, like, I mean, I don't want to belittle it or diminish it, but we're like, it's like 30 to 80,000 people over a period from about 1450 to about 1750, and that's cutting a little bit off on each end in the time frame. But so we've got 300 years where we've got like this many people, and this is out of millions and millions of people in Europe. It's a very small percentage of the population, whereas a significantly larger portion of the population was killed in the conflict between the Reformers and the Catholics. And so you had a lot more people killed just for being Protestants, or a lot more people being killed just for being Catholic, than you've got people being killed for being witches. And so the witch hunts and the witch persecutions are important. They're a major thing. They're a travesty. And a lot of people died that probably shouldn't have died. But they were part of a context where everyone is terrified, where there are tons of threats from a social perspective. There are a lot of crimes you can just be killed for. If you speak out about an opinion that the state doesn't like, they don't have to call you a witch to kill you. They can just be like, that's sedition, that's treason. And in those cases, sometimes torture would still be allowed. And like, when you talk about no, they burned the witches. Well, no, they didn't burn the witches. They hung the witches. It's like, well, it depends on where you are and when you were. But generally, if it was treason, you've got a good chance of being burned. If you were um, a heretic, you've got a good chance of being burned. So these other things that you could be accused from, you could have a pretty horrible way of dying too. But then on top of that, you're like, yeah, these plagues keep happening. We keep not having enough food. Trade is falling apart. I don't know which religion I am this week because I don't know which religion the king is. And if I say I'm the wrong religion, I might go to jail. There's a lot going on that people are afraid of. There's a lot of stress, a lot of social pressure that is incredibly dangerous. And again, I think a lot of us are also able to empathize with that right now, with things that are happening and things that we're seeing where some of us may be less potentially affected by it, but still have human empathy and able to see what's happening to the people who are affected by it. Some of us are potentially on the cusp of being affected by it a little more than other people. And all of us are down the line at some point potentially affected by it and hopefully see that. And so we can get a sense of what these people were going through, not just the witches, but kind of everyone in society that is creating this. And so even with the trial transcripts, we have to look at that light. We have to look at the fact that like everyone was terrified. And that doesn't mean that it was okay that these things happened, but it also explains somewhat why they did. And by having that explanation, this isn't a, okay, we're explaining this away. This is a, we need to read this into the data. We need to say, okay, these are things where this is coherent, this makes sense, and this is just the product of people being terrified. And so we're going to look at this part that makes sense, and we're going to say, like, okay, we don't know what really happened with this other part, but common sense says this part is probably at least corrupted, and maybe we're not going to learn as much from this. And then there's also, again, going to be those common sense of this was crazy, and there's just a bad actor happening here. So, like, there are folklore things we can look at from looking at Heinrich Kramer and the Hammer of the Witches. He didn't whole stock invent the thinking or the ideas that he's talking about. He does pull from other earlier theologians and earlier writers, and he does pull from actual folk beliefs and things people believed happened at the time. He also had like a clear, weird hard on about witch torture. And so, and he had like some issues with women. So we can factor those things in. And as we factor those things in, we can start to filter out like, okay, what from this source is actually useful for actually understanding things that may have been happening or things that people may have at least been believing. And some sources we can look at and be like, there is too much of the corruption, and maybe there is some stuff that is actually useful or true here, but we don't need to dig through and shift through this. There's other sources we can use and look at. So we have to be aware of the nature of the source, and I think that's the thing that some people don't get. They think that the sources have to be all thrown out whole stock, and anyone looking at them is not looking at them critically. But they're only useful if you look at them critically. But they are incredibly useful when you do. So as we engage with trial material, the first thing that we want to consider is sort of a metric for this trial material. So P.G. Maxwell Stewart, who has written a ton of books on the history of witchcraft, suggests that the uptick in Scottish witch hunts in the late 16th and 17th century does not reflect an actual witch hunt because of how it compares to the continental witch craze examples. Critics say that there was a severe increase in witch trial cases during this period, and the percentage of trials that occurred then relative to the rest of the period is high enough to justify calling it a witch hunt. They also point out that this is when witch finders begin to be used. So what Maxwell Stewart is basically distinguishing is saying that, yeah, we don't have the same mass accusations. It's like saying that, okay, in this 1 year period, there were 10 to 20 trials, whereas before that you had 1 or 2 trials a year. That's not the same as looking at an area where this village, and this village were all annihilated in a 5 year period. There's a huge difference there. So there are also other regions that are kind of similar to what Maxwell Stewart is pointing out in Scotland. You have active witch hunting by professionals and magistrates happening, or active programs soliciting accusations happening. But normal trials fitting legal norms are happening when these accusations are brought in. It's not just bringing everyone into like the middle of the street and saying these people are all witches, and so because they've been accused, they clearly are. There are accusations that are dismissed or not pursued. There are increases in trial numbers, but not to the same as the hysteria levels. They're not based on lists of random names that are collected and having large swaths of towns executed. And they're not necessarily trials where there is significant use of torture, or there may not be torture at all, but there is still almost always coercion. Coercion is an important element, even when there is not like physical torture, and sleep deprivation, mental and emotional torture are probably present regardless, but those were not understood in the same way at the time. So, example of this, the Benandanti trials explored by Carlo Ginzburg. Um, a lot of times people were just like, well, okay, you flew out of your body and you fought witches and interacted with spirit beings. Okay, you can't do any important functions in the church anymore, but that's your punishment. Or okay, you're gonna go to jail for like a month. Don't do this again, and that's your punishment. Or this what you're describing is super weird and we don't know what to do with this. So maybe come back in like a few months and we'll talk about it again. And if you don't show up, we're not going to come looking for you. Like those are things that literally happen. Those are like all real examples. And so that's a point where there's an uptick in trials in that region. They have magistrates that are specifically looking for and soliciting accusations, but they're not running around killing everybody, and they're not going crazy with it. They're actually looking at a real process. There are points where there's even one case where someone admits to killing a baby with witchcraft, and the doctors are like, there's no evidence that witchcraft was used to kill this baby. There's a dead baby, but they're like, it wasn't magic. It was normal, natural causes this baby died from. And the courts are like, well, clearly, if witchcraft wasn't used, you aren't guilty of using witchcraft to kill this baby, so we're throwing out your case, even though the guy is confessing to doing it. And this is like, I think, very different from how most people understand or assume trials worked. And that kind of, to me, shows that we can look at the data that happened to those trials and say, all right, this is not entirely just people losing their minds and the courts forcing this down people's throats and claiming that these things were happening. In the 16th century in Medina, they brought in a new magistrate, Spina, who he established a program of clemency where if you came and you reported any accusation about things you knew about from any period of time, you would be forgiven for not reporting it earlier, and you would not be drawn into it or viewed as a suspect or guilty. And he still had cases that people brought in, and he was like, okay, this is interesting. I'm going to write some stuff down about it, but I'm not actually going to call anyone in and investigate this because it's just weird. Like there's a really great werewolf case in Medina at the time where that happens. So for our purposes, we might want to use three categories as a metric. So you have a witch trial, where you've got kind of an individual isolated incident happening. So somebody gets accused, somebody gets tried. There's not a lot of other trials happening in that town or that region in that time period. It's just kind of a one-off thing happens, or like it happens occasionally, but with the same frequency any other crime would be happening. You have witch hunts, which is what Maxwell Stewart is saying didn't happen, but witch hunt is probably the best way to describe it, where you have basically those characteristics we described above. They have professional people looking for witches. They have open calls for accusations. They're actively pursuing witches, actively trying witches. There's an increase in the number of trials, but the trials are being held responsibly. They're being held under a normal standard. They're not killing masses of people, and they're dismissing cases that don't make sense. Then you have witch hysteria, where you have an outbreak of massive accusations and killings, often written about generally rather than collections of case files and individual case reporting. significant use of torture, major loss of life in a short period. And so a trial can be a good source of information, but it could also be limited without other trials to compare it to because we're just looking at one incident. A hunt can be very useful because it will represent several cases. Uh, it might also have reporters reporting on it because there might be notoriety going on at the time. And assuming it fits those characteristics where things are being handled responsibly, and for the recording, there are air quotes happening now, that where we can say like, okay, there's going to be problems in this data because of the way the data was collected, but there should still be meaningful data here. Those hunts are probably one of the best types of time frames to look at. Hysteria, where you've got the large scale mass executions, wiping out of populations, those will almost never be useful as the claims are often fantastical and are not contextualized within individual cases. When we look at trial accounts, we want to consider the relevance of torture if it's known. So we want to look at like, do we have evidence torture was used in this case based on the time period and the place that it was happening? Is it unlikely that torture was used? Coercion is always used, but actual physical torture might not be, or it might be minimal. And so in those points, probably better data. But that torture question is still kind of a question. So in talking about some of these cases where some people look at them and are like, okay, this is a useful case. Like Maxwell Stewart, he takes a lot of cases and looks at them as, okay, we've got to trust what they're saying happened to them. But Julian Godard is like, we really shouldn't. None of this was real. And so in criticizing that, he points out that one of the cases that Maxwell Stewart points to, the confession, the person rescinded their confession when they were brought to the gallows and saw the gallows. So like Julian Godard's position is, hey, torture was probably used to facilitate these confessions, so we probably shouldn't believe the confession. And hey, this guy, he rescinded his confession. But he rescinds it when he sees that he's about to be publicly executed, which is essentially also a form of torture. Like there's a psychological torture there. And so if we're going to say that like his rescinding his confession is real because he sees he's about to be killed and he thinks that he can get away if he says it wasn't real, then that there's no difference between that and a torture situation. So we can't say that like, well, when they say it's not real because something is scaring them, that's right. But when they say it is real because something is scaring them, that's wrong. So torture, I think, is a more complicated thing than people treat it as. There's a lot of claims that there's evidence that torture doesn't work, but there's also a lot of times where people will say things that are true, not just things that people want to hear when they're put in a situation where they're like, okay, if I don't confess to what's happening, something horrible is going to happen, and I don't want that horrible thing to happen. So I think it's a little more complicated than any torture means it's not real. But I'm also not a specialist on torture psychology. I feel like that'd be a weird thing to be a specialist on, but I'm sure, well, I mean, there are people who are. We've got to consider upper influences and lower influences. So we want to consider what the folk beliefs of the people were. We want to consider if there was preaching happening in the area about witches. If there are preachers going through the area saying, the Antichrist is in charge of the church, and he has an army of witches and priests who are working with those witches, and that's why Latin is evil, and you can't go to mass, and you need to just have prayer services in your vernacular because the witches are going to get you if you go to mass. And then everyone's like, oh my God, I saw a witch at the church the other day. It might be because these preachers came in and convinced everyone there were witches. So you want to look at, like, was there something that was happening in the area that caused a particular uptick, that caused people to begin expressing beliefs that they didn't have already? And are people just repeating back what the theologian said, or are they saying things that have a different character from what the theologian said? Is there some independence to what they're saying? We want to look at the beliefs of the magistrates and theologians as well. Like, how are we seeing them influence what is being stated in the trial accounts? Are they changing and rewriting the transcripts? Are they giving leading questions that are forcing confessions or witness statements in a certain way? We want to try to filter those things as much as we have the data to do that. Sometimes we only have what the witness says. Sometimes we only have what the confession says. We don't always have a full transcript available of like what the questioning was. But when we do have it, we want to look at those things and maybe look at like if there are writings by those magistrates, because some of the magistrates were pretty famous and pretty important. We want to look at if there were things that we know about their beliefs that are shaping what's happening in this particular trial differently than what we might see in another trial. And that doesn't mean that means those things have to get filtered out. We just have to look at how those beliefs fit in. So like Pico della Mirandola, if he's running a trial, he totally believes that there are people who fly out in spirit and do battle spiritually, and that all this stuff happens because he was like a patron for people that he believed were saintly and good doing this. But he was also someone who was prosecuting witches for doing this when he thought that they were doing it in a bad way. So his beliefs would quite potentially shape his writing on witches and shape how he interacted with a trial if he was involved in it. And so we want to factor those sorts of things in. A big question is, are guilty verdicts witches? So I'm saying like we want to rely on these trial documents. We want to accept to a degree what people are saying and not assume that everything that someone said is false. Because how horrible is that? For us to go back and say, okay, all these dead people, they said these things, but we know nothing they said was ever true and we can never consider it. And I'm still saying don't consider it face value, but we can't consider any of it at all, even by filtering it or critically looking at it. And to say that nothing that these people said was reliable, like that really takes away the little agency that those people had left at all. And I think that that's problematic. But I also think that we can't just say, just because someone was found guilty, they were a witch. And some of that goes down to like, what are we defining as witches? Are we just saying witches were people who did magic that was criminal? Like if you killed someone with magic, you're a witch, but if you killed someone with magic, you're cunning folk? Or are we saying witches were people who did specific types of magic or had specific magical features? In which case, a court verdict's not going to tell us that. The description of what was happening is going to tell us that. We also have to accept that some cases are probably relatively real and some cases are not. That there's going to be cases that were botched. There's going to be cases where people lied. There are going to be cases where people just had mental health issues and said crazy stuff that hurt themselves. But the thing is, we can't go back and examine things beyond the data that's there and say one way or another which of those things was happening. Which again, that's one of those issues is trying to dismiss all the cases. Is we're not going back and looking at new data. We're not going back and re-examining these cases and retrying them. We're just saying, whole stock, this period of 300-400 years, everything was wrong, and that's probably not true. So, but we also don't want to be overly credulous. We don't want to just accept that because a court said this person's guilty of witchcraft, that they were actually guilty of witchcraft, or that they were even what we would think of as a witch in whatever model of witchcraft we're using. So again, there are frequently reasons to doubt trial information, but that doesn't mean that all the trial information is wrong. There are copious examples that show us that there were real practices in the trials, so we have to use our judgment. So, for our last, if we go over a few minutes, hopefully that's not bad, but I want to look at a couple examples from trials. So we'll start pretty simply. Most people are familiar with Isabel Gowdy. Some people are familiar with Androman. Both of them Scottish witches. The motifs present in their cases recur in a lot of others, but they're known for specific details that are somewhat richer details than other accounts. Both claim to have had sex with a spirit to begin their exposure to witchcraft and magic, with the implication that this is how they received power or gained access to assistance from that spirit. So that is our piece of trial information that we're looking at. This idea that sex with a spirit either witches you or gives you access to spirit allies or access to teaching or assistance from a spirit. So this occurs outside of witch trials in folklore. So the folklore of Thomas the Rhymer shows this, as well as numerous other folk and fairy tales, both in the Gaelic culture that would have potentially influenced them. Actually, I'm not really sure if they were lowlands or highlands and whether or not they would have been more Germanic or more Gaelic. But both cultures have that, as well as numerous other outside cultures have that recurring theme. Uh, the spell for the Seven Sisters in the Ford collection presents a spell for conjuring a fairy for sex. We also have several other fairy conjurations that at least imply sex or bonding as a means of obtaining a fairy's power and assistance. So it's something where we have folklore for this. We have written magical documentation that people engage in this with instructions for how to do it. Um, so while this element of witchcraft is described in trial data, it's also heavily corroborated outside of the trial data. And it's a theme that the theme of being presented to these sorts of spirits and having interactions with these spirits in trials is super common. It recurs all over. So a lesser known example than either of those, because they're both kind of famous. In 1588, Alison Pearson of Fife confessed that she was in regular contact with the fairies, or the good neighbors, and that she had been presented to the Queen of Elfame. So this is a common element of witch trial accounts, but it's also an element that we see corroborated in all sorts of other sources. And if we look back at various mythologies and we look at the other religions that influenced those regions, we'll also see those processes of humans being married to spirits, being married to gods, and then having special status for that. We see it in the Catholic Church. Nuns marry God, but there is also and priests marry the church. There's also another practice where someone, without becoming a nun, can become a spouse of God. And it's still practiced today amongst traditional Catholics, just very rarely. Gowdy describes feasting with the elf queen, the devil, and the imps, who are likely fairies. Demdike and Chaddix from the Pendle trials also have accounts of a phantasmal feast presented by their familiars. So we can look at that and say, okay, witches, they feast with spirits. Fairies presenting phantasmal food occurs heavily in folk stories. Folk stories present accounts of dining with fairies or setting a meal for fairies as a way to incur their favor if done properly, but if done improperly, it can also incur their wrath or incur dangerous obsession from the fairy. We have several spells from cunning folk and also grimoire examples, both in the North Atlantic Isles and further abroad, of setting meals to conjure fairies and dining with them. Living spirit traditions have rituals in which meals and offerings are provided while participants are possessed by spirits. Medieval church documents and laws describe this belief as well, denouncing its reality during points where the church did not believe in witches. And this shows that these beliefs were widespread and well known and routinely engaged in by people without being invented by the church. So again, it's a description in a trial, but it's also heavily corroborated by multiple sources. In terms of examples of trials where people are not crazy, Catherine Malpas and Thomas Saunders in 17th century Scotland. Malpas alleged to be possessed by the devil and bewitched, but court records show, and I haven't read the court record of that initial trial, but the following trial, the follow-up to it, where Thomas Saunders is on trial for either coercing or paying Malpas to pretend to be possessed and bewitched. I have read those court documents. And so an important thing to note here is it's kind of vague and uninformative. She was possessed and bewitched. Doesn't describe magical practices, doesn't describe her experience, doesn't describe what she's doing. And so it illustrates that the courts did investigate these claims, but sometimes they found the claims to be false or fraudulent. In the case of Susanna Hinchcliffe and Anne Shilto, which is also late 17th century Scotland, several of their neighbors come to their defense and claim that their reputations, their participation in the community, and a complete lack of evidence prove that they are not witches. So it's not they get like one witness. There's a collective statement from the people in their community. There's like, these two women are not witches. No one has ever seen them do witch stuff. They're good people that participate in the community, and there's no reason to believe this. Um, there was a Connecticut witch trial case in the 17th century in which the Gibson family, who in this case these were my ancestors, they accused a neighbor of witchcraft and ended up having to pay restitution for defamation because other people in the community came through and were like, there's no way this woman is a witch. These people are just going after her. And really, likely, Gibsons might have had some witchcraft going on and were possibly later convicted of witchcraft. So it was common means of this was also a common means of defense in Scandinavian trials. The idea that the community would come together and be like, this person's reputation is good. This person works in the community. This person's not a witch. So examples like these show us that trials were not simply a process of credulity and railroading in all cases. Sometimes they were, and that we have to remember that. We have to remember that a lot of people were bad actors. That there were a lot of people that did do horrible things during this period, but that doesn't mean that this was always the case. And usually it's localized in specific areas in specific time periods, usually over like a few years or a couple decades. And you can look at them and tell this is when everything was going crazy. So let's not look at this period unless we want to look at hysteria. Let's look at these other periods where things are more normal. So there's room to assess the trials and to determine their utility because there are vastly more accusations than convictions. And so it's not uncommon for magistrates to even recognize magical activity and determine that it wasn't necessary to pursue it. In fact, the church gave guidance to magistrates not to simply pursue magical activity, but to focus on the heretical and normal civic courts. Because like a lot of people are like, oh, the Inquisition did this, or oh, the church courts did this. And they did, but they stopped a lot sooner than the civic courts did. And a lot of times the church courts would be like, we don't want this case. This doesn't seem meaningful to us. We don't think anything's happening here. And if someone really was about it, they would force it to go to a civic court. And then eventually most of the cases were going to the civic courts. In England and Scotland, they all went to civic courts because it was a criminal offense that you were dealing with, and witches mostly were tried when their magic was used for criminal purposes. Sometimes things went wrong otherwise, though. So in civic cases, the courts were intended to focus on crime, sedition, and treason performed through magic. Again, they didn't always stick to that, but that was what they were doing primarily. These norms broke down sometimes, and again, in specific periods and places, we can see them break down more. But under normal functioning circumstances, we can identify examples where magic was clearly being used and practiced, where the descriptions that are happening, we can clearly say, yeah, this person obviously is doing magic. Whether they were doing harmful magic or not is another question. Whether they were a supernatural monster who left their body at night and partied with spirits, sometimes that's another question. Although sometimes they admit that. So we can look at these cases and use them as a guide for exploring the practices that constellated around the concept of being a witch. Oh my gosh, this is so much better time-wise than I expected it to be. Hopefully I didn't just talk too fast. But two more people to look at examples. Agnes Sampson. Agnes Sampson probably should be more famous than she is. And I will even admit that I'm not like Agnes Sampson like specialist or like know a ton about her, but she is someone that I've seen come up routinely, and she's from one of the most famous witch trials, the North Berwick trials, which occurred in either the very end of the 16th or the very beginning of the 17th century. I can't remember if they were the 1590 to 91 or if, no, they had to be around then because I think 1607 was when James the First and Sixth published Demonology, which actually when he published that, like people talk about that as spurring the Scottish witch trials, but the Scottish witch trials actually downturned with the publication of that text. So North Berwick trials, like earlier when I was talking about like, oh dude, did you hear like the king and the queen almost died because like this count hired some witches to kill them with a storm on their boat? That's the North Berwick trials. And so a lot of times like people will be like, witches were always poor and indigenous. And there's a freaking count who is like next in line to be king. And he's like, allegedly, he's like, if I kill James, I get to be king. You know the easiest way to do that? Frickin' witches. I'm going to go hire a whole collective of witches. And so there's this claim that he gathers them all together and they have this conspiratorial meeting, which almost never happened. Covens, probably not a huge thing that was routinely happening. Witches were probably mostly on their own. Um, that doesn't mean there were no covens. That doesn't mean there were no gatherings. And again, if I'm going to say that we have to consider what people said about their lives, some of them claim to go to meetings. But most things where we talk about the Sabbath and most things where we talk about witches going to meetings, they're flying in spirit to some spiritual place for a meeting. They're not going to the kirk and being out in the churchyard having a meeting, unless you're Isabel Gowdy. And then she left a broom in her bed. She didn't fly, she walked. So Agnes Sampson, though, allegedly at a meeting, but this meeting, not a coven, not a diabolical meeting, an actual conspiracy to kill the king, where the witches are probably being paid by this count to do it because he's then going to be king. And so that's actually super believable. There's no reason to believe that didn't happen. And we know that through history, there were points where people got together and paid magical practitioners and had conspiracies. No one questions Lavoisin and the affair of the poisons in France. Everyone knows that happened. But people are like, yeah, there's no way this count paid witches to meet up at a churchyard and kill the king. There's no reason to think that that didn't happen. Agnes Sampson was allegedly one of those witches. She was well known in the community for magical practice, both for healing and otherwise. And so, again, she may have been hired into this conspiracy to kill the king, but there may have not been a conspiracy. So here's an example from one of her trial transcripts. To be quit of him, I think this is somebody's father-in-law that was an asshole. She made a picture of wax and raised a spirit at a waterside beside a briar bush, desiring her to enchant it to serve for his destruction and send it to said woman to be put under his bed sheet or bedhead. And so we're at 7:31, so if you've got to leave, that's fine. I'm just going to finish out because we're like almost through, and it'll probably be less than like well, maybe a little more than 5 minutes. So with that, everyone recognizes that. That is like super common spell work. She makes a poppet out of wax. She doesn't say that. It doesn't say that she used the briar bush, that she did it by the briar bush, but obviously she's pulling thorns from the briar bush to put in the poppet. Otherwise, you're not going to be there unless you're just invoking the thorniness of the briar bush. She's at a riverside, a waterside. Now that's something where any African practitioner of magic or anyone who is associated with African diaspora sorcery is going to understand, like, yes, water spirits, they can be helpful, but they can also be super dangerous. And you can go to those water spirits and have those water spirits F someone up. That is something that I think is like less of a common folklore thing in like modern witchcraft, but there are definitely memes about it now, so maybe it's becoming common. Hopefully it is. But that's not something that's exclusive to Africa. That's something like all over the world where people understand like water spirits, depending on your relationship with them, water spirits can mess you up because you drown in the water. And so she's going to the water side, and so that's the clear implication there is that she's taking this water spirit, cursing this poppet through that, and now that the poppet is cursed, it's not just that this spirit's going to go do these things, not just like the power of the briar bush and the power of the water spirit, but that power is attached to this poppet, and it's going to be put under this guy's bed sheet or under the head of his bed so that he is physically in contact with the curse, and the curse affects him. So these are things where that's not all being explained there, but we can look at it and say, yeah, we understand everything that's happening in the magic there. This is clearly a spell. You could pull this spell directly out of this trial transcript and say, here's a spell you could go do if you want to kill someone's father-in-law. Not that I'm saying you should go kill someone's father-in-law or anyone else, but also I'm saying do what you want with your witchcraft. It's your witchcraft, and you can learn that from a trial transcript. Same woman. She confesses that she raised the devil by her evocations to ask if a gentlewoman should live or die. He appeared to her in the likeness of a black dog before supper, she being alone. So, before supper part's not really important. This isn't saying that she had dinner with this black dog. It's just giving the time that it happened, because then it goes on to talk about other events in the transcript. even her being alone may or may not be important. But what we see here is the reflection of the idea of a spirit showing up in the form of an animal. And this is not necessarily her familiar, but it could be. Um, but we have the act of conjuring a spirit to gain information. So she's trying to find out whether or not this person is going to live or die because the person's family is hiring her to find this out. And then the language of it is a little unclear. I believe the person does die, but I'm not sure if that's what the transcript's saying. But again, this is basically an act of divination. And so it's explaining that witches would call spirits to find out what was going to happen to people, not just that they would kind of like look into a crystal ball and see it themselves. Our final example, Janet Boyman. In 1573, Janet Boyman tried to cure a man by taking his shirt to a stream near Arthur's Seat, where she summoned a ferryman, asked him about the patient, and washed the shirt in the south flowing water. So here we have a nice happy one. She's healing someone. She's not killing someone or prophesying about someone's death, but it's also a different person. So elements here that we can see. So she goes to a special place. She goes to Arthur's Seat. So that's a space that's going to have magical associations with it because it's associated with King Arthur. Lots of places, particularly in Wales, that are special places because of Arthurian associations. So those places have power. She summons a ferryman. So she doesn't do the magic just by herself. She calls on a spirit assistant. The ferryman is the source of the diagnosis. So this fits with earlier iatromantical practices where you would go to a god or a spirit to find out what was wrong with the patient and how to heal the patient. It doesn't really explain whether or not the ferryman is involved in washing the shirt. He may have instructed her to do this. He may be assisting with the magic to do this. But what we have here is divination through use of the ferry, going to a special magical spot to do it, washing the patient's shirt, presumably to wash away the illness, in the south flowing stream. And so the directionality is likely important. I don't have further examples of that, but I have seen things showing that this was also like a common folk spell at that time to wash someone's shirt in south flowing water in order to heal them. So it's something where we can corroborate that with other examples as well. And so those are the sorts of things that we can find by looking at witch trials, looking at these trial accounts where we see, okay, these are these things that these people are being accused of. Okay, well, we've got other things showing that this is magic that actually people practiced. We have things explaining the ideas and beliefs around this magic. Clearly, this is a real thing. Whether this person practiced it or not, there may be a question. But we know people did practice it. We know it was something that people believe people practiced. And so we can be inspired by that practice. We can kind of tap into that power and continuity of practicing that the way that people practiced it previously. We can also, if we've got people where they've got a lot of things showing up in their trial, like Agnes Sampson, where she's known in the community for doing magic. We see multiple examples in her trial accounts that are showing actual magical practices. This is probably someone who did magic and very possibly could be someone who was a witch. So this is someone that we can turn to and say, all right, when we call upon witches to aid us, when we honor witches on our altars, when we look for witches to have spirit relationships with, Agnes Sampson is someone we can turn to. And so there's an element of saying, like, okay, these people were oppressed, these people were tortured, these people were insane, they didn't know what they were saying. So we don't know any of that for the most part. Sometimes the torture, sometimes we do know that. But sometimes we don't. Like Isabel Gowdy, there's not a record of torture in her case. But people often dismiss it as she was this young woman who was tortured. We don't know how old she was. We don't know if she was a young woman. We don't know if she was an older woman. She could have been in like the prime of her life when this happened. And there's a lot of people who also look at her and say, like, she might have not been deluded. She might have not even been doing magic. She might have just been brilliant winding up these magistrates, and we don't know what the outcome of her trial was, whether she was found guilty and executed, or whether they were like, okay, you hung out with some fairies, this is weird, but we don't need to kill you for that. The fact that they definitely recoded a lot of it into devilry, they probably were not letting her off in that case. But we don't always have the full picture in order to dismiss that these people were capable of understanding what was going on with them. So there's an element of respect that we can say we respect the possibility that this person had some agency, that this person knew what they were saying and knew what they were doing. We respect that they may have had some power and agency in life before this happened to them, and that they may have had these magical practices, may have made a living out of them. And we're going to honor and respect this person and connect with them and give them some additional meaning in the afterlife through doing that, rather than simply dismissing them into obscurity. I think that's a much better way of engaging with these memories and giving these people a meaningful magical afterlife, as opposed to giving them an exoneration that they don't need, that's not going to help them, and it may not be true anyway. So we can learn from them, we can also connect with them, we can honor them, and we can say that this is something we value. We value that these people had magic. We value that these people had this knowledge, that these people had this willingness, this bravery to engage with these spirits, to engage with these magical practices, to make their lives better, to make the lives of people around them better, or to make the lives of people around them worse, if it was something that made their life better, or protected the people that they were close to. There's power and there's importance to that too. There's something to be respected there as well. And I think those people deserve that respect. And that is what we do when we recognize this actual magical afterlife that is keeping with the actual beliefs and experiences of the people at the time. So that is what I have on that. Thank you for coming to the class, and thank you for staying the extra 10 minutes. If you kind of like the way that I address and think about and look at these things, probably my book on familiars is the one that deals most closely with this type of subject and draws on this type of thinking and approach, as opposed to my other works. And that's the one that I brought the most copies of, so they should have those downstairs in the merchant room. I've got a couple here too. If anyone had any questions, I'm good to stick around for a few minutes for questions. If not, if you got to take off and get ready for the ball, I understand that too.